Behind the golden gates of Raven's Hollow Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. What began as whispered conversations in shadowy corridors would soon explode into a confrontation that no royal protocol could contain. Queen Consort Isabella had always been ambitious, but her latest scheme crossed a line that even the patient Crown Prince Alexander couldn't ignore. When she attempted to manipulate the ailing King Edmund's final decisions, using his declining health as leverage for her own political gain, she underestimated the fierce loyalty of his eldest son. The palace walls had witnessed many secrets, but none quite like this. As Isabella's web of manipulation tightened around the throne, Prince Alexander found himself caught between his duty to preserve his father's dignity and his growing rage at the woman who was supposed to protect the crown's honor. The breaking point would come on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, when years of suppressed anger finally erupted in a way that would forever change the royal succession. This is the story of how power, betrayal, and family loyalty collided within the most powerful family in the realm, where the stakes weren't just personal. They were the future of an entire nation. The morning mist clung to the ancient towers of Raven's Hollow Palace like a shroud, fitting for what would become one of the darkest chapters in the royal family's recent history. King Edmund sat in his private study, his once powerful frame now diminished by the weight of 73 years and a recent bout with pneumonia that had left him frailier than anyone dared to acknowledge publicly. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the morning briefings, though whether from age, illness, or the mounting pressure from his wife remained unclear. Queen Consort Isabella had been increasingly present during these private moments, her influence growing as his strength waned. What had once been loving support had gradually transformed into something more controlling, more calculating. Crown Prince Alexander noticed the change immediately when he arrived for his weekly private audience with his father. The usual warmth in the king's eyes seemed dulled, and there was a tension in the room that hadn't existed before Isabella's recent surge in involvement with state affairs. She sat beside the king's desk, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming silently on a leather portfolio filled with documents that Alexander wasn't permitted to review. "Father, you look tired," Alexander observed, settling into the chair across from the massive oak desk that had served 5 generations of monarchs. His concern was genuine, born from years of watching his father carry the weight of the crown with unwavering dignity. Isabella's smile was practiced and cold. "His Majesty has been working tirelessly on some very important decisions regarding the future of the monarchy. Haven't you, darling?" Her voice carried a subtle edge that made Alexander's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. King Edmund nodded slowly, but his response lacked his usual conviction. "Yes, there are matters that require immediate attention. The Council of Ministers has presented several proposals that Isabella believes would benefit the realm greatly." The way his father deferred to his stepmother in that moment sent warning bells through Alexander's mind. In all his 38 years, he had never seen King Edmund yield decision-making authority to anyone, not even during his most challenging political crises. The monarchy had survived centuries precisely because of the careful balance of power and the king's ultimate authority in matters of state. Alexander's training as heir apparent had taught him to read political undercurrents, and what he sensed in that room felt dangerous. Isabella's influence had been growing steadily since their marriage 5 years ago, but this felt different. This felt like a power grab disguised as wifely concern. "What kind of proposals?" Alexander asked carefully, maintaining the respectful tone required in his father's presence while keeping his growing suspicion in check. Isabella's eyes flashed with something that might have been annoyance before she composed herself. "Oh, various administrative matters. Nothing that needs to trouble you just yet. Your father and I are still reviewing the details." The dismissal stung more than Alexander expected. As Crown Prince, he should be involved in any significant policy discussions, especially those affecting the monarchy's future. The fact that Isabella was speaking for his father and actively excluding him from the conversation represented a fundamental breach of royal protocol. King Edmund remained silent during this exchange, his gaze fixed on the rain beginning to streak down the tall windows. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Isabella rose gracefully from her chair, gathering her leather portfolio with practiced efficiency. "I should let you two have your time together," she said, though her tone suggested she was doing them a favor rather than respecting their long-established tradition. "Edmund, don't forget about our meeting with Lord Chancellor Westfield this afternoon. The documents need your signature before the evening session." After she left, the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. King Edmund seemed to exhale deeply, as if he had been holding his breath during her presence. Alexander waited several moments before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Father, is everything truly all right? You seem different lately." The king's eyes met his son's for the first time since the conversation began. For a brief moment, Alexander glimpsed the sharp intelligence and quiet strength that had defined his father's reign, but it was quickly clouded by something that looked disturbingly like resignation. "The crown is a heavy burden, Alexander. Sometimes we must make choices that serve the greater good, even when they feel personally difficult." The cryptic response only deepened Alexander's concern. His father had always been direct in their private conversations, sharing the complexities of leadership with the honesty that would prepare Alexander for his own eventual reign. This evasiveness felt foreign and troubling. They discussed routine matters for the remainder of their meeting, but Alexander's attention kept drifting to the stack of papers Isabella had left on the side table, clearly visible, but positioned just out of his reach. The bold letterhead of the Royal Legal Department was unmistakable, though he couldn't make out the specific content from his position. As he prepared to leave, Alexander made a decision that would prove pivotal in the days to come. "Father, I'd like to review any major policy proposals before they're implemented. As your heir, I should understand the direction we're taking the monarchy." King Edmund's response was barely above a whisper. "Some decisions have already been set in motion, my son. I'm afraid it may be too late to change course now." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Too late. What could be so urgent and final that it couldn't be discussed with the crown prince? As he walked through the palace corridors afterward, Alexander's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next few days brought a series of small, but significant changes that confirmed Alexander's growing fears. Isabella began attending official state meetings that had traditionally been restricted to the king and his closest advisors. She started issuing instructions to palace staff regarding protocol changes, claiming they came directly from the king. Most concerning of all, several longtime palace officials approached Alexander privately to express their confusion about new directives that seemed to contradict established procedures. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the king's private secretary for over 2 decades, was the first to voice what others were thinking. "Your Royal Highness, forgive my boldness, but there have been some unusual requests regarding His Majesty's schedule and communications. The Queen Consort has asked that all correspondence pass through her office first, and she's requested changes to the guest list for next week's state dinner." Alexander felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. State dinner guest lists were matters of diplomatic importance, carefully crafted to balance international relations and domestic political considerations. The idea that Isabella would unilaterally modify such arrangements without consulting him or the Foreign Office was deeply troubling. "Has my father personally confirmed these requests?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lady Margaret's hesitation spoke volumes. "The request came through the Queen Consort's office, Your Highness. She indicated they had His Majesty's full approval, but we haven't received direct confirmation from the king himself." That evening, Alexander made his way to his father's private quarters, a breach of protocol that spoke to his growing desperation. He found King Edmund alone in his sitting room, staring into the fireplace with an expression of profound weariness. "Father, we need to talk." The conversation that followed would haunt Alexander for months to come. King Edmund admitted, in halting phrases punctuated by long silences, that Isabella had been pressuring him to sign documents that would significantly alter the line of succession and grant her expanded authority as Queen Consort. The legal implications were staggering, potentially giving her unprecedented power to influence royal decisions even after Edmund's eventual death. "She says it's for the stability of the monarchy," the king explained, his voice heavy with doubt. "She argues that having a strong Queen Consort will provide continuity during the transition period when you assume the throne." Alexander struggled to maintain his composure as the full scope of Isabella's manipulation became clear. She was using his father's declining health and natural concerns about the succession to gain permanent political power that went far beyond traditional royal consort roles. "Father, these documents would fundamentally alter centuries of constitutional monarchy. The implications for parliamentary relations alone could destabilize the entire government." King Edmund nodded slowly, as if confirming thoughts he had been afraid to voice. "I know, my son, but Isabella can be very persuasive, and she claims to have support from several members of parliament. She says opposition would only create public controversy that could damage the crown's reputation." The manipulation was masterful in its simplicity. Isabella had isolated the king, created a false sense of urgency around decisions that didn't require immediate action, and positioned herself as the solution to problems she had likely invented. Alexander realized with growing horror that his father was being systematically undermined by the woman he had married for companionship in his later years. As Alexander left his father's quarters that night, he made a decision that would define not only his own future, but the future of the monarchy itself. Isabella's quiet coup had to be stopped, but doing so would require him to challenge her directly, potentially creating the very public controversy she claimed to be avoiding. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Isabella succeeded in manipulating the succession documents, she could potentially influence royal policy for decades to come, undermining the constitutional balance that had kept their nation stable for generations. Alexander knew he had one chance to protect both his father's legacy and the crown's integrity, but the cost of failure would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Standing in the moonlit corridor outside his father's quarters, Alexander felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight for his family's honor and his nation's future, knowing that some battles, once begun, could never be undone. The dawn following Alexander's revelation brought no comfort, only the stark reality of what needed to be done. As he dressed for the day ahead, Alexander's reflection in the mirror showed a man transformed by purpose and grim determination. The comfortable routine of royal duties would have to take a back seat to something far more urgent and dangerous. His first stop was the palace archives, a cavernous space beneath the main structure where centuries of royal documents were preserved in climate-controlled perfection. If Isabella was indeed manipulating succession documents, Alexander needed to understand exactly what legal foundations she was attempting to alter. Lord Pemberton, the elderly keeper of royal records, greeted Alexander with surprise. "Your Royal Highness, we weren't expecting you this morning. How might I assist you?" "I need to review all documents related to succession law and Queen Consort authorities, particularly any recent additions or proposed amendments," Alexander replied, keeping his voice level despite the urgency he felt. What he discovered over the next 3 hours chilled him to the bone. Isabella had been methodically researching historical precedents for expanded queen consort powers, focusing particularly on periods when kings had been incapacitated or deceased. The documents she had compiled painted a picture of careful, strategic planning that had been months in the making. More disturbing was the revelation that she had already begun the process of legitimizing her proposed changes. Several legal scholars had been consulted, apparently at the king's request, though Alexander suspected the truth was far different. Parliamentary liaisons had been quietly approached about potential constitutional modifications that would strengthen the monarchy's stability during transition periods. Alexander photographed the most relevant documents with his personal phone, a violation of archive protocol that spoke to his desperation. The evidence he was gathering would be crucial if he needed to prove Isabella's manipulation to others, but he also knew that possessing such information would make him a target for her increasingly sophisticated political maneuvering. His next move required even greater delicacy. Alexander needed allies within the palace, people who had witnessed Isabella's behavior and could provide testimony if the situation escalated to formal challenges. The problem was that Isabella had been cultivating her own network of supporters, using a combination of charm, implied royal favor, and subtle intimidation to build loyalty among key staff members. Sir James Whitmore, the deputy private secretary, had served the royal family for 15 years and had always maintained strict political neutrality. When Alexander approached him in his office, the older man's expression immediately became guarded. "Your Royal Highness, if this concerns recent administrative changes, I should mention that the Queen Consort has asked to be informed of any discussions regarding palace operations." The statement confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Isabella wasn't just manipulating his father. She was creating a surveillance network within the palace itself, monitoring communications, and potentially controlling information flow. The implications for royal privacy and security were staggering. "Sir James, I need you to speak honestly with me, regardless of any other instructions you may have received," Alexander said, using the authoritative tone he had inherited from his father. "The integrity of the monarchy may depend on your candor." What followed was a careful dance of words as Sir James revealed the extent of Isabella's infiltration into palace operations. She had requested access to confidential briefings, demanded changes to security protocols, and begun issuing directives about media relations that went far beyond her official role as queen consort. She claims everything has His Majesty's approval, Sir James admitted reluctantly. But many of us have noticed that the king seems less involved in day-to-day decisions than he has been historically. There's a concern among senior staff that he may not be fully aware of all the changes being made in his name. Alexander felt a surge of relief that others had noticed the same troubling patterns he had observed. However, that relief was quickly tempered by the realization that if the situation continued unchecked, Isabella would soon have effective control over most aspects of royal operations. I need detailed documentation of every request that has come from the Queen Consort's office over the past 3 months, Alexander instructed. Include dates, specific instructions, and any instances where staff were told not to discuss these matters with other members of the royal family. Sir James hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll prepare that information discreetly, Your Royal Highness. But I should warn you that the Queen Consort has been very specific about wanting to know if anyone questions her authority or discusses palace operations without her knowledge. The threat was clear, and Alexander felt a flash of anger at Isabella's audacity. She was creating an atmosphere of fear and surveillance within their own home, turning loyal staff members into unwilling participants in her power grab. That afternoon brought an unexpected opportunity to observe Isabella's methods firsthand. Alexander arrived early for a scheduled meeting with the Lord Chancellor and found Isabella already in the room, reviewing documents with Lord Chancellor Westfield. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed his presence. Alexander, darling, you're early, Isabella said with her practiced smile, though her eyes betrayed annoyance at the interruption. We were just discussing some preliminary matters before your father joins us. Lord Chancellor Westfield looked uncomfortable, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious uncertainty. Alexander had known Westfield for over a decade and had never seen him appear so ill at ease during royal meetings. What preliminary matters? Alexander asked directly, taking a seat at the conference table without waiting for invitation. Isabella's smile became strained. Just some procedural questions about implementing new policies. Nothing that concerns you directly at this stage. The dismissive response confirmed Alexander's suspicions about Isabella's attempts to exclude him from important discussions. As the crown prince, he should be included in any policy conversations, particularly those involving constitutional or administrative changes. When King Edmund arrived 20 minutes later, Alexander watched carefully as Isabella subtly guided the conversation toward topics that had clearly been predetermined. She had prepared talking points, suggested responses to potential objections, and positioned herself as the expert on matters that traditionally fell under the Lord Chancellor's purview. Most concerning was how she occasionally answered questions directed at the king, smoothly inserting herself into discussions where her input wasn't requested. King Edmund seemed to accept this behavior as natural, though Alexander noticed moments of confusion when Isabella's responses differed from his own initial thoughts. The meeting centered around proposed changes to royal protocol during public appearances, modifications to the process for granting royal honors, and adjustments to the constitutional role of the queen consort during periods when the king might be temporarily incapacitated. On the surface, the proposals seemed reasonable, even beneficial for royal efficiency. However, Alexander's legal training allowed him to see the broader implications that others might miss. Each seemingly minor change would incrementally shift power away from traditional monarchy structures toward Isabella personally. Cumulatively, the modifications would grant her unprecedented authority that could persist even after King Edmund's death. Lord Chancellor, what would be the constitutional implications if these changes were implemented simultaneously? Alexander asked, knowing the question would force Westfield to consider the broader legal ramifications. Westfield glanced nervously at Isabella before responding. Well, Your Royal Highness, individually each change falls within acceptable parameters for royal prerogative. However, I must admit that the combined effect would represent a significant shift in traditional power distribution within the monarchy. Isabella's composure cracked slightly at this honest assessment. Surely the Lord Chancellor agrees that modernizing royal operations is necessary for maintaining public confidence in the monarchy? Modernization is indeed important, Alexander interjected. But these changes appear to concentrate unprecedented authority in the Queen Consort's office. Historically, such concentration of power in a single position has led to constitutional crises. The tension in the room became palpable. Isabella's mask of gracious cooperation slipped as she realized that Alexander was challenging not just individual proposals, but the entire framework of her power grab. King Edmund looked confused and tired, clearly overwhelmed by the legal complexities being discussed. Perhaps we should table these discussions until His Majesty has had more time to consider all aspects, Lord Chancellor Westfield suggested diplomatically, though Alexander could see relief in the older man's eyes at the prospect of delay. Isabella's response was swift and calculated. Actually, time is somewhat critical. The upcoming state visit from Emperor Nikolai requires clear protocol regarding queen consort authority during formal ceremonies. We can't afford confusion about chains of command during such high-profile events. Alexander recognized the manipulation immediately. Isabella was creating artificial urgency around decisions that could easily be delayed, using external pressure to force acceptance of her proposals. The state visit was indeed important, but existing protocols were perfectly adequate for handling ceremonial requirements. The current protocols have served successfully for similar state visits, Alexander countered. Unless there are specific security concerns or diplomatic requirements that necessitate changes, I see no reason for urgency. King Edmund finally spoke, his voice weaker than Alexander remembered from previous meetings. Isabella has raised some valid concerns about ensuring smooth operations during important events. Perhaps we could implement temporary measures for the state visit and review permanent changes afterward. Alexander felt his heart sink as he realized how thoroughly Isabella had manipulated his father's thinking. The king was accepting her manufactured crisis as legitimate and agreeing to temporary measures that could easily become permanent once established as precedent. Father, temporary measures often become permanent fixtures, Alexander said carefully. Constitutional changes should never be rushed, regardless of external pressures. Isabella's eyes flashed with barely contained anger. Alexander, surely you recognize that your father's wisdom and experience qualify him to make these decisions? Your concerns are noted, but ultimately His Majesty's judgment must prevail. The subtle rebuke was delivered with perfect royal etiquette, but Alexander understood the underlying message. Isabella was positioning herself as the defender of royal authority while simultaneously undermining it through her manipulation of the king. As the meeting concluded with several decisions deferred pending further review, Alexander realized that direct confrontation within formal settings would be insufficient to stop Isabella's campaign. She was too skilled at manipulation, too careful to avoid obvious overreach that could be easily challenged. Walking back to his apartments after the meeting, Alexander felt the weight of an impossible situation settling on his shoulders. His father was being systematically manipulated by a woman who had gained his trust, and was using that trust to accumulate power that threatened the very foundations of constitutional monarchy. The evidence was mounting, but evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient. Isabella had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, framing her actions as supportive of royal efficiency rather than personal ambition. Challenging her directly would require Alexander to essentially accuse his father of being mentally compromised, a charge that could destroy both the monarchy's credibility and his own relationship with the king. That evening, as Alexander reviewed the documents Sir James had discreetly provided, the scope of Isabella's operation became even clearer. She had been methodically building a comprehensive power base, using her position as queen consort to influence everything from staff appointments to policy development. Most troubling was the pattern of isolation she had created around King Edmund. Key advisors found their access limited, important briefings were filtered through Isabella's office, and dissenting voices were gradually marginalized through a combination of subtle pressure and administrative obstacles. Alexander realized that he was witnessing a quiet coup, executed with such sophistication that its success seemed almost inevitable. Unless he could find a way to expose Isabella's manipulation without destroying his father in the process, the monarchy would fundamentally change in ways that could destabilize the entire constitutional system. The stakes had never been higher, and Alexander knew that his next moves would determine not only his own future, but the future of centuries of royal tradition. The battle for the soul of the monarchy was about to begin in earnest. The third week of Alexander's investigation brought a development that transformed his growing concern into urgent alarm. Lady Catherine Harrington, his father's longtime physician, requested a private meeting under circumstances that immediately raised red flags about the king's health and care. Dr. Harrington had served the royal family for 12 years, her discretion and competence earning her the rare distinction of being trusted with the most sensitive aspects of royal medical care. When she approached Alexander through unofficial channels, requesting a meeting away from the palace, He knew the situation had reached a critical threshold. They met in a small cafe in the village nearest to Alexander's country estate, far from the watchful eyes of palace staff or media attention. Dr. Harrington looked exhausted, her usually pristine professional appearance showing signs of strain that spoke to weeks of internal conflict. "Your Royal Highness, I'm violating every protocol by speaking with you directly, but my oath as a physician compels me to share my concerns," she began, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious emotion beneath her words. What she revealed over the next hour painted a picture of medical manipulation that shocked Alexander despite his growing awareness of Isabella's methods. The Queen Consort had begun attending the king's medical appointments, initially presenting herself as a concerned wife seeking to support her husband's health care. At first, her presence seemed natural and supportive, Dr. Harrington explained. His Majesty appreciated having her there, and she asked intelligent questions about his treatment and prognosis. However, her involvement gradually became more controlling and concerning. Isabella had begun questioning medical recommendations, suggesting alternative treatments that would keep the king more alert for important meetings while potentially compromising his long-term health. She had also requested detailed information about cognitive medications and their effects, claiming she needed to understand how to best support the king during official duties. Most alarmingly, Isabella had started arriving at medical appointments with prepared lists of questions and concerns that seemed designed to elicit specific types of medical opinions rather than genuine health assessments. She had asked pointed questions about the king's mental acuity, decision-making capacity, and prognosis for cognitive decline. "I believe she's trying to establish medical justification for limiting His Majesty's direct involvement in royal decisions," Dr. Harrington concluded. "She's asked me repeatedly about the medical basis for determining when a monarch might need assistance with official duties." Alexander felt his blood run cold as the implications became clear. Isabella wasn't just manipulating his father politically. She was potentially creating medical pretexts for assuming greater authority as his supposed caregiver and protector. The combination of manufactured health concerns and legal power consolidation could give her nearly unlimited control over royal operations. "What is my father's actual medical condition?" Alexander asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the truth. Dr. Harrington's response was both reassuring and troubling. "His Majesty is dealing with age-related health challenges and the lingering effects of his recent pneumonia, but his cognitive function remains largely intact. However, the stress of recent months and certain medications the Queen Consort has encouraged me to prescribe are affecting his energy levels and decision-making confidence." The revelation that Isabella had influenced medical prescriptions added another layer to her manipulation strategy. By encouraging treatments that made the king more dependent and less decisive, she was creating the very problems she claimed to be solving through expanded Queen Consort authority. Alexander asked Dr. Harrington to document her observations and concerns, knowing that medical testimony would be crucial if the situation required formal intervention. However, he also understood that challenging Isabella's medical influence would be extremely delicate, as it involved questioning decisions that appeared to prioritize the king's health and comfort. Armed with this new information, Alexander decided to take a significant risk. He arranged a private dinner with his father, just the two of them, away from Isabella's ever-present influence. The setting was the king's private study, where they had shared countless conversations over the years about leadership, duty, and the weight of the crown. King Edmund seemed more alert that evening, perhaps benefiting from a brief respite from the constant pressure of official duties and Isabella's intense attention. For the first time in weeks, Alexander glimpsed flashes of his father's former sharp wit and political instincts. "Father, I need to discuss something with you that may be difficult to hear," Alexander began carefully, knowing that his approach would determine whether this conversation strengthened or destroyed their relationship. What followed was the most challenging discussion of Alexander's life. He carefully presented his observations about Isabella's behavior, focusing on documented actions rather than accusations of intent. He shared the concerns raised by palace staff, the constitutional implications of proposed changes, and the patterns he had observed in their recent meetings. King Edmund listened in silence for nearly an hour, his expressions cycling through disbelief, confusion, and gradually dawning comprehension. When Alexander finished his presentation, the silence stretched for several minutes as the king processed information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about his wife's motivations. "You're suggesting that Isabella has been manipulating me," The king finally said, his voice heavy with a mixture of hurt and growing anger, that her concern for my health and the monarchy's stability has been a facade for personal ambition. Alexander chose his next words with extreme care. Father, I'm suggesting that actions taken in your name may not align with your actual wishes or the monarchy's best interests. Whether this represents manipulation or misguided assistance is something you'll need to determine for yourself. The distinction was crucial. Alexander was presenting facts and patterns while allowing his father to draw his own conclusions about Isabella's motivations. This approach preserved the king's dignity while providing him with information necessary for informed decision-making. King Edmund rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, his silhouette framed against the evening light. When he spoke again, his voice carried traces of the authority that had defined his reign for over 4 decades. "Show me the documents," he said simply. Alexander spent the next 2 hours walking his father through the evidence he had compiled, including the archive research, staff testimony, and Dr. Harrington's medical observations. King Edmund asked sharp questions that demonstrated his cognitive abilities remained far more intact than Isabella's recent behavior suggested. The most telling moment came when Alexander showed his father copies of documents he had allegedly signed, authorizing various policy changes and administrative modifications. King Edmund studied several papers carefully before shaking his head. "I don't remember signing these specific versions," he admitted. "Isabella often brought me papers to sign during busy periods, explaining that they were routine administrative matters that required my authorization. I trusted her summaries rather than reviewing each document in detail." The revelation that Isabella had been misrepresenting documents while obtaining the king's signature added a new dimension to her manipulation strategy. She had been creating legitimate royal authorizations for illegitimate purposes, using the king's trust against both him and the monarchy. Alexander felt a surge of protective anger on his father's behalf, but he also recognized that they now had clear evidence of deception that went beyond political maneuvering into potential fraud. The situation had escalated from family conflict into constitutional crisis. "What do you want to do, father?" Alexander asked, knowing that the next decisions would determine not only Isabella's fate, but the future credibility of the monarchy itself. King Edmund returned to his chair, his bearing noticeably more upright and decisive than Alexander had seen in weeks. "First, we need to secure any documents that haven't been signed yet. Second, we need to quietly reverse any authorizations that were obtained through misrepresentation. Third, we need to address Isabella's behavior in a way that protects both the monarchy's dignity and our family's privacy." The plan that emerged from their discussion was elegant in its simplicity, but complex in its execution. They would gradually reassert the king's direct authority over royal operations while creating documentation that would protect the monarchy if Isabella attempted to challenge their actions publicly. However, both men understood that Isabella wouldn't accept the loss of her accumulated power without a fight. She had invested too much in her strategy and gained too much authority to simply retreat when confronted. The real test would come when she realized that her manipulation had been discovered and that her carefully constructed power base was being systematically dismantled. Alexander left that meeting with renewed hope, but also a clear understanding that the most dangerous phase of this crisis was just beginning. Isabella had proven herself to be intelligent, ruthless, and strategically sophisticated. Cornering such an opponent could lead to desperate actions that might damage the monarchy, even if they ultimately succeeded in stopping her. The next morning brought immediate confirmation of their concerns. Isabella arrived at the king's study earlier than usual, accompanied by several documents that required immediate attention. However, this time King Edmund was prepared for her tactics. "Isabella, I'd prefer to review these documents privately before we discuss them," he said, his tone carrying a subtle authority that she hadn't heard in months. Her reaction was immediate and telling. The practiced smile faltered, her eyes showed a flash of calculation, and her entire demeanor shifted as she recognized that something had changed in the power dynamic she had worked so carefully to establish. "Of course, darling. But Lord Chancellor Westfield is expecting these back this afternoon. The timing is somewhat critical for the upcoming parliamentary session." The response was pure Isabella, creating artificial urgency to pressure immediate action without allowing time for careful consideration. However, King Edmund was now prepared for such manipulation. "Then, Lord Chancellor Westfield will need to adjust his schedule to accommodate proper royal review procedures," the king replied firmly. These documents will receive the attention they deserve, regardless of external timelines. Alexander, watching from across the room, saw Isabella's mask slip completely for just a moment. In that instant, her expression revealed the calculating ambition that had driven her entire campaign for power. She had underestimated both the king's residual strength and Alexander's determination to protect his father. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. Isabella knew that her position was being challenged, and both Alexander and his father understood that she would use every resource at her disposal to maintain the authority she had accumulated. The quiet coup was about to become an open conflict that would test the very foundations of royal tradition and constitutional monarchy. As Isabella left the king's study that morning, her parting words carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. "I do hope we can resolve any misunderstandings quickly and discreetly. Public confidence in royal stability is so important during these uncertain times." Alexander recognized the implicit message. Isabella was prepared to create public controversy if her power was challenged, potentially damaging the monarchy's reputation to protect her own position. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had essentially disappeared. The final confrontation was approaching, and Alexander knew that when it came, there would be no possibility of compromise or graceful retreat. Either Isabella's manipulation would be exposed and stopped, or the monarchy would be fundamentally altered in ways that could destabilize the entire constitutional system. Standing beside his father in the aftermath of that tense morning encounter, Alexander felt the weight of history settling on their shoulders. The decisions they made in the coming days would echo through generations, determining not only their own legacy but the future of an institution that had guided their nation for over 1,000 years. The morning of the confrontation arrived with deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm of historical proportions. Alexander had spent the previous evening making final preparations, securing documents, briefing trusted advisors, and steeling himself for what he knew would be the most consequential conversation of his life. Isabella had requested an urgent meeting with both King Edmund and Alexander, ostensibly to discuss security arrangements for the upcoming state visit from Emperor Nikolai. However, Alexander suspected that she had become aware of their investigation and was preparing to escalate her own campaign before they could act against her. The meeting was scheduled for the king's formal conference room, a choice that spoke to the gravity of whatever Isabella intended to discuss. This was the same room where declarations of war had been signed, where constitutional crises had been resolved, and where the fate of the monarchy had been decided countless times over the centuries. Alexander arrived first, using the extra time to review his strategy one final time. He had learned from Dr. Harrington that Isabella had scheduled a medical consultation immediately after this meeting, supposedly to discuss adjusting the king's medications for optimal performance during the state visit. The timing suggested that she intended to use this confrontation to justify increased medical intervention in the king's decision-making capacity. King Edmund entered the room with more energy and focus than Alexander had seen from him in months. Their private conversations had clearly reinvigorated the king's sense of purpose and authority, though Alexander worried about his father's ability to withstand the emotional manipulation that Isabella would undoubtedly employ. When Isabella arrived, she brought with her an unexpected ally, Sir Roderick Blackwood, the palace's longtime legal advisor, whose presence immediately signaled that this meeting would involve far more than ceremonial discussions. Sir Roderick's expression was carefully neutral, but Alexander detected signs of discomfort that suggested he might be an unwilling participant in whatever Isabella had planned. "Gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this urgent meeting," Isabella began, her tone carrying an authority that would have been appropriate from the queen but felt presumptuous coming from a queen consort. "Recent events have made it necessary to address some fundamental questions about royal succession and the distribution of authority within the monarchy." Alexander felt his jaw tighten as Isabella's true intentions became clear. She wasn't retreating in the face of their investigation. She was launching a preemptive strike designed to formalize her power before they could stop her. "Sir Roderick has prepared documentation that will clarify the queen consort's role during periods when the king's health might affect his ability to fulfill all royal duties," she continued, gesturing to a thick portfolio of legal papers. "Given Edmund's recent challenges with pneumonia and the ongoing demands of royal responsibilities, it's prudent to establish clear protocols now rather than face uncertainty during a future health crisis." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Isabella was using the king's recent illness as justification for permanently altering succession law, creating a framework that would grant her authority that traditionally belonged to the crown prince. She was essentially arguing that the king's health made him unfit for full royal duties while positioning herself as the solution to a problem she had helped create. King Edmund's response surprised everyone in the room. "Isabella, I appreciate your concern for my health and the monarchy's stability. However, I'm curious about the specific legal authorities you believe need clarification. As far as I'm aware, existing succession law provides clear guidance for all circumstances you might be addressing." The question was delivered with the sharp intelligence that had characterized King Edmund's reign for over 4 decades. Alexander felt a surge of pride and relief as he realized his father was not only alert and focused but was actively challenging Isabella's premise. Isabella's composure faltered slightly before she recovered with practiced grace. "Darling, the legal complexities involved in modern monarchy require more sophisticated approaches than historical precedents might provide. Sir Roderick has identified several areas where current law creates potential ambiguities that could lead to constitutional crises." Sir Roderick shifted uncomfortably in his chair before responding with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, the Queen Consort has asked me to research expanded authorities for royal spouses during periods of monarchical transition or incapacity. While such authorities do have historical precedents, implementing them would represent a significant departure from current constitutional practice." Alexander recognized that Sir Roderick was trying to signal his discomfort with Isabella's proposals without directly contradicting her in front of the king. The legal advisor had clearly been pressured into developing these documents, but retained enough professional integrity to present them with appropriate caveats. "What specific authorities are we discussing?" Alexander interjected, knowing that forcing Isabella to articulate her demands explicitly would expose their true scope and implications. Isabella's eyes flashed with annoyance at his interruption, but she maintained her composed demeanor. The documents outlined several areas where expanded Queen Consort authority would enhance royal efficiency and stability. These include oversight of royal communications during health-related absences, authority to make decisions regarding ceremonial functions when the king is temporarily incapacitated, and expanded input into succession planning to ensure smooth transitions. Alexander felt his anger rising as the full scope of Isabella's power grab became clear. She was seeking authority over royal communications, which would give her control over the monarchy's public face and political messaging. Ceremonial authority would allow her to influence diplomatic relationships and state functions. Most dangerously, input into succession planning could potentially affect the line of inheritance itself. "Isabella, these authorities would fundamentally alter the constitutional relationship between monarchy and parliament," Alexander stated firmly. "They would grant Queen Consort powers that have never existed in our system of government and could destabilize the entire framework of constitutional monarchy." The confrontation Alexander had been preparing for was finally at hand. Isabella's response would determine whether this crisis could be resolved through family discussion or would require more drastic measures to protect the monarchy's integrity. Isabella's mask finally dropped completely. "Alexander, your concerns are noted, but ultimately these decisions rest with your father and the legal advisors he chooses to consult. Your role as crown prince is important, but it doesn't give you veto power over measures designed to strengthen the monarchy during challenging periods." The rebuke was delivered with icy precision, but it revealed Isabella's fundamental misunderstanding of royal protocol and constitutional law. She was treating the monarchy as if it were a business where authority could be redistributed based on immediate needs rather than a constitutional institution governed by centuries of precedent and legal tradition. King Edmund's response was measured but carried unmistakable steel. "Isabella, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of the authorities you're describing. The Crown Prince's concerns about constitutional implications aren't just relevant. They're essential to any discussion of succession law or royal prerogatives." Alexander saw Isabella's strategy crumbling as his father reasserted the authority she had been gradually usurping. However, he also recognized that a cornered opponent with Isabella's intelligence and ambition could become extremely dangerous. Her next move confirmed his worst fears. "Edmund, I'm concerned that the stress of recent months and your ongoing health challenges may be affecting your judgment about these important matters. Perhaps Dr. Harrington should join our discussion to provide medical perspective on your capacity for handling complex constitutional decisions." The statement was a direct attack on the king's mental competence, delivered with the false concern of a devoted wife, but clearly intended to establish medical justification for removing his decision-making authority. Alexander realized that Isabella was prepared to publicly question the king's mental capacity, if necessary, to maintain her accumulated power. King Edmund's reaction was swift and decisive. "Isabella, I find your suggestion deeply inappropriate and completely unacceptable. My mental capacity is not subject to your evaluation, and I resent any implication that my judgment regarding constitutional matters requires medical validation." The king's response carried the full weight of royal authority, but Alexander could see the emotional toll that Isabella's attack was taking on his father. She had struck at the deepest fears of any aging monarch, questioning not just his decisions but his fundamental competence to rule. Alexander knew that the moment for diplomatic resolution had passed. Isabella's willingness to attack the king's mental capacity demonstrated that she would use any weapon available to maintain her position, regardless of the damage to the monarchy or the royal family. "Isabella, I think this meeting has revealed some fundamental disagreements about royal authority and constitutional law that can't be resolved through continued discussion," Alexander said, his voice carrying the cold formality of official royal business. "Perhaps it would be appropriate to suspend these deliberations until all parties have had time to consider the implications of the proposals being discussed." Isabella's eyes narrowed as she recognized the dismissal for what it was, a declaration that her manipulation had been discovered and would no longer be tolerated. Her response was immediate and calculated to inflict maximum damage. "I'm disappointed that family concerns are being subordinated to political calculations," she said, her tone shifting to one of wounded dignity. "My only motivation has been protecting Edmund's health and ensuring the monarchy's stability during a challenging period. If that dedication is now being questioned, perhaps it's time for me to reconsider my own role in supporting royal operations." The threat was clear. Isabella was prepared to create a public scandal by portraying herself as a devoted wife being persecuted by an ambitious son and a mentally declining husband. The potential damage to the monarchy's reputation could be catastrophic, exactly the outcome Alexander had been trying to avoid. However, King Edmund's next words demonstrated that he finally understood the full scope of Isabella's manipulation and was prepared to accept the consequences of stopping her. "Isabella, your concerns about my health and the monarchy's stability have been noted and evaluated. However, I've concluded that the measures you're proposing would create more problems than they would solve. I won't be implementing any of the authorities outlined in Sir Roderick's documents, and I expect all previous authorizations obtained through incomplete information to be reviewed and potentially rescinded." The declaration was unequivocal and represented a complete repudiation of Isabella's entire campaign for expanded authority. Alexander felt both relief and apprehension as he realized that his father had chosen to confront Isabella directly, despite the potential for retaliation. Isabella's final response confirmed that the battle for the monarchy's future was far from over. "I'm deeply saddened by this turn of events, but I want everyone in this room to understand that my conscience won't allow me to remain silent if I believe the monarchy is being damaged by poor judgment or declining capacity. The people of this nation deserve leadership that serves their interests rather than personal or political agendas." As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave, Isabella's parting words carried an unmistakable threat. The quiet manipulation was over, and the public phase of this constitutional crisis was about to begin. Alexander and his father sat in silence for several minutes after Isabella's departure, both understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. The woman who had shared the king's bed and his trust had declared war on the very institution she had sworn to support and protect. The real test of their resolve and the monarchy's strength would come in the days ahead, as Isabella implemented whatever strategy she had prepared for this exact scenario. Alexander only hoped that their preparation and the strength of royal tradition would be sufficient to withstand the storm that was about to break over the crown. The explosion came exactly 72 hours after the confrontation in the conference room, but not in the way Alexander had anticipated. Instead of a public scandal orchestrated by Isabella, the crisis erupted from an unexpected source that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to protect. Lord Chancellor Westfield arrived at the palace in the early morning hours, his face grave with the weight of catastrophic news. Behind him came Sir Marcus Thornton, the head of royal security, whose presence immediately signaled that the situation had moved beyond political maneuvering into potential criminal territory. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, we have discovered irregularities in royal finances that require immediate attention, Lord Chancellor Westfield announced, his usual diplomatic composure replaced by barely controlled alarm. Alexander felt his blood run cold as the implications became clear. Isabella's final gambit wasn't public humiliation or constitutional challenges. It was financial sabotage designed to create a scandal that would destroy the monarchy's credibility while positioning her as an innocent victim of royal family dysfunction. The evidence that Sir Marcus presented was devastating in its scope and sophistication. Over the past 18 months, Isabella had been systematically redirecting funds from various royal accounts, using her access to the king's financial authorization codes to transfer substantial sums to accounts nominally designated for charitable activities and palace improvements. The total amount involved approaches £12 million, Sir Marcus reported, his voice heavy with the magnitude of the betrayal. The transfers were structured to appear legitimate, using existing budget categories and approved vendors. However, detailed investigation reveals that many of the purported recipients are shell organizations that ultimately trace back to accounts controlled by the Queen Consort. King Edmund listened to the briefing in stunned silence, his face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and gradually building fury. Alexander watched his father process the reality that the woman he had trusted with his most intimate secrets had been systematically stealing from the crown while manipulating him into granting her expanded authority. How was this discovered? Alexander asked, though part of him dreaded learning that Isabella's financial crimes might already be public knowledge. Lord Chancellor Westfield's response provided both relief and additional concern. The irregularities were identified during routine preparation for the annual royal financial audit. However, our investigation also uncovered evidence that suggests the Queen Consort was preparing to accelerate her activities. Several large transfers were scheduled for this week, apparently timed to coincide with the state visit when attention would be focused elsewhere. The strategic timing confirmed Alexander's worst suspicions about Isabella's intelligence and planning capabilities. She had intended to complete her financial extraction while using the chaos of a major diplomatic event to cover her tracks. The confrontation in the conference room had apparently convinced her to accelerate a timeline that might have originally extended much further into the future. Where is the Queen Consort now? Sir Marcus asked, his security training evident in the immediate concern for containing the situation before it could escalate further. She departed the palace early this morning, King Edmund replied, his voice hollow with the weight of betrayal. She claimed to be visiting her sister in Scotland for several days. I now suspect that trip has a rather different purpose than family reunion. Alexander felt a surge of protective anger on his father's behalf, but he also recognized that they were facing a crisis that went far beyond personal betrayal. If Isabella's financial crimes became public knowledge, they would create exactly the kind of scandal that could destabilize public confidence in the monarchy and provide ammunition for Republican movements that sought to abolish the royal system entirely. What are our options for addressing this situation without creating a constitutional crisis? Alexander asked, knowing that their response would need to balance justice with institutional protection. Lord Chancellor Westfield had clearly been considering this exact question. We have several potential approaches, each with significant implications for the monarchy's future. We could pursue criminal charges, which would ensure justice but create massive public scandal. We could negotiate private restitution in exchange for Isabella's voluntary withdrawal from royal life. Or we could attempt to contain the situation entirely, though that approach carries substantial risks if the information leaks through other channels. King Edmund's response surprised everyone in the room with its decisiveness and moral clarity. £12 million has been stolen from the British people in the name of the crown. Personal embarrassment and institutional concerns cannot take precedence over justice and accountability. Alexander felt a surge of pride in his father's integrity, but he also understood the potential consequences of that noble stance. Pursuing criminal charges against the Queen Consort would create a media firestorm that could dwarf any previous royal scandal, potentially providing Isabella with the public platform she needed to present herself as a victim while damaging the monarchy's reputation. Father, I completely agree with your moral position, Alexander said carefully. However, we need to consider how Isabella might respond to criminal charges. She's demonstrated a willingness to attack your mental competence and could use a public trial to present a narrative that portrays you as a confused elderly man being manipulated by an ambitious son. The warning proved prophetic when Sir Marcus's phone rang with an urgent call from palace communications staff. Isabella had apparently anticipated the discovery of her financial crimes and had prepared her own preemptive strategy for managing the crisis. Your Majesty, the Queen Consort has contacted several major media outlets with claims that she's being persecuted by the Crown Prince due to concerns about Your Majesty's declining mental health, the communications director reported through Sir Marcus's phone. She's alleging that financial irregularities were the result of confusion about authorization procedures and that she's being scapegoated to cover up more serious problems with royal decision-making capacity. Alexander felt the situation spiraling beyond their control as Isabella's final strategy became clear. She was prepared to destroy the monarchy's credibility to protect herself, using the king's age and recent health challenges as weapons against the very institution she had sworn to serve. However, King Edmund's response demonstrated that Isabella had underestimated both his remaining strength and his commitment to royal duty. Sir Marcus, please coordinate with Lord Chancellor Westfield to prepare a complete criminal referral regarding the financial irregularities. Additionally, I want a thorough investigation of all activities conducted in my name over the past 18 months, with particular attention to any authorizations I supposedly provided for actions I don't specifically remember approving. The king's decision to pursue full criminal prosecution despite the personal and institutional costs represented a moment of moral courage that would define his legacy. Alexander realized that his father was choosing justice over convenience, integrity over reputation, even if that choice might damage the monarchy he had spent his life serving. I'll also be requesting a complete medical evaluation from an independent panel of physicians to address any questions about my mental competence, King Edmund continued. If Isabella wants to make my health a public issue, then the public deserves complete and accurate information rather than politically motivated speculation. The announcement surprised everyone in the room, but Alexander immediately understood his father's strategic thinking. By voluntarily submitting to medical evaluation, the king would deprive Isabella of her most powerful weapon while demonstrating the transparency and accountability that would be necessary for maintaining public trust during the crisis ahead. Over the next several hours, the palace became a carefully controlled storm of activity as legal teams, communication specialists, and security personnel implemented what amounted to a comprehensive response to an unprecedented royal crisis. Alexander found himself coordinating multiple aspects of the crisis response while also preparing for his own inevitable role as the public face of royal accountability. The first media reports appeared by mid-afternoon, with Isabella's version of events receiving prominent coverage across multiple outlets. Her narrative was skillfully crafted, portraying her as a devoted wife trying to protect an aging husband from the manipulations of an ambitious son who was using financial irregularities as a pretext for removing her influence from royal affairs. However, the palace's response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, they released a statement confirming that financial irregularities had been discovered and referred for criminal investigation, while also announcing the king's decision to undergo independent medical evaluation. The combination of transparency and accountability began to shift public perception as media coverage gradually focused on the facts of the case rather than Isabella's manufactured narrative. The turning point came when Dr. Harrington, apparently freed from her previous constraints by Isabella's departure, provided a detailed medical statement confirming that while the king was dealing with age-related health challenges, his cognitive function remained intact, and there was no medical basis for questioning his decision-making capacity. Alexander watched the crisis unfold with a mixture of admiration for his father's courage and apprehension about the long-term consequences for the monarchy. The next few weeks would determine whether royal transparency and accountability could overcome the damage caused by Isabella's betrayal, or whether her manipulation had inflicted wounds that would permanently weaken the institution they both loved. As evening fell on that tumultuous day, Alexander found his father in the same study where they had shared their first honest conversation about Isabella's manipulation. King Edmund looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if confronting the truth had lifted a burden he had been carrying for months. "Do you think we made the right choice?" the king asked, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty that comes with momentous decisions. Alexander considered the question carefully before responding. "Father, you chose justice over convenience and transparency over concealment. those choices align with everything the crown should represent. Isabella's crimes were committed against the British people, and they deserve to know the truth regardless of the personal cost to our family. King Edmund nodded slowly, his expression settling into the calm resolution that had characterized his finest moments as monarch. The crown has survived many crises over the centuries by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of service and accountability. I believe we can survive this challenge as well, though it may require us to be more open about royal operations than previous generations might have preferred. The conversation continued late into the evening, as father and son planned not just their response to the immediate crisis, but their vision for a monarchy that could maintain public trust in an era of unprecedented scrutiny and accountability. Isabella's betrayal had created a crisis that threatened the royal institution, but it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate that the crown could police itself and maintain the moral authority necessary for constitutional monarchy in the modern world. As Alexander returned to his apartments that night, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in just a few weeks. The comfortable routines of royal duty had been replaced by the harsh realities of family betrayal and constitutional crisis. However, he also felt a sense of clarity about his future role and responsibilities that hadn't existed before this crisis began. The woman who had tried to manipulate the crown for personal gain had ultimately strengthened it by forcing a confrontation with fundamental questions about royal authority, accountability, and service. Isabella's greatest manipulation had failed because she had underestimated the moral courage of the men she sought to control, and her failure had created an opportunity for renewal that might not have existed otherwise. The monarchy would survive Isabella's betrayal, but it would emerge from this crisis fundamentally changed, more transparent, more accountable, and more clearly committed to the principles of service that justified its continued existence in a democratic society. The crown's greatest test had become its greatest opportunity for demonstrating the values that would carry it forward into an uncertain but promising future.